Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. And on behalf, my name is Fabrizio Felloni. I'm Deputy Director of Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD. And on behalf of our Director, Mr. Indra Naidu, I would like to welcome you to this seminar organized by our office. And it's a seminar which features a special guest, Mr. Hans Lundgren, who is a member of Evaluation Advisory Panel for IOE. I will say just a few words of introduction, although, to be honest, with a guest like Hans, the introduction is probably not necessary. Those of you who are acquainted and familiar with the evaluation community know that he is one of the historical memory of evaluation community. And he has a very long, distinguished career in evaluation. And over 30 years of his professional life, he spent at the Development Assistance Committee of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and more precisely, he was the head of a secretariat for evaluation. And those who are familiar with evaluation know that the evaluation criteria, we work with them very often. They're part, I could say, of a grammar of a language that we speak of evaluation. And Hans is one of the persons, and that's why he's particularly well known in the evaluation community. He's one of those who created the evaluation criteria. He once told me a very fascinating story of how he came to happen. Of course, I will not tell you because he might say a part of it in his presentation. But he's one of those who really created the evaluation criteria, which we now all use. So let me just welcome him again. Thanks, Hans, for being available. And now, without much further ado, we would like to listen to your presentation. And then there will be some time at the end to ask questions or present comments. So thanks again. And Hans, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Fabrizio, and to colleagues at IFAD for inviting me to this. I'm very pleased to see so many names and people participating in this. Criteria might not sound as the most fascinating subject, but actually we have seen when we did the consultation and revision, a lot of emotions, a lot of reactions. So this is a more exciting topic than it might sound in a way. And thank you for the introduction. I worked a long time for the OECD, but I also actually have a UN background. I worked with the UNDP in field offices in Africa, and actually in Mali, I was in charge of the agricultural portfolio and also for emergency aid when there was a big famine there a long time ago. And of course, I also worked with the UNESCO's Oversight Committee and operational coordination. So I have worked in project management and implementing things before going into evaluation. And nowadays, I'm partially retired and I'm evaluating more of Paris bistros and restaurants and development programs. But that's another story. Let me try to get you to my PowerPoint. Share. Okay. Go back. This is the first slide. So this is an overview of what I will present to you. A little bit about the background and context, because the criteria fits into a broader normative framework of principles, guidance, and standards. Then I will go in a little bit, talk about how we revised the 5 original criteria, the consultation and revision process. And then I will present each of the criteria to you, and particularly the changes that we have made. And hopefully you will find that we have improved things, and a little bit about how they relate to each other. And finally, a little bit about principles and guidance for use. So the carrots here are in the picture because they represent both routes and incentives. And starting with the routes, evaluation began in earnest in the field of development in the 1980s. Evaluation units were set up in ministries and agencies and in the UN, and we set up the OECD DAC evaluation network to bring together people and learn from each other. And the network will actually celebrate 40 years of existence next year. And I worked for over 30 years with that network, so it's partly a baby of mine and maybe grown up now, actually. The development aid, as it was called then, had of course started already 20 years before, with the advent of independence of many countries. And it took some time actually before evaluation really got into the center and focus of attention. And that's when we started with the creation of our network. And shortly after I began actually my job with the OECD, I started to work with the network. And we found that there was unclarity on the role of evaluation and quite a mixed bag of evaluation units. So we needed some common understanding, and we started to work on the principles for aid evaluation. It took us about 2 years to get agreement on this, and they clarified a lot of things, namely what we meant by evaluation, defined the role of evaluation in development agencies, some key features of the evaluation function, and the relation of evaluation to policy and management functions. And some actually of the key principles still serve in the peer review process today for individual member countries. I mention this because the criteria have their roots and their origin in the principles. Relating to the carrots in the previous slide, the objective of the normative work was to raise the quality of evaluation, to promote better use, and to build stronger evaluation units. And during the 1990s, we noted a huge amount of confusion in terminology, which really made collaboration and even dialogue in workshops and in evaluations difficult. So we needed to develop some common language. And we did that with the glossary of terms in evaluation, which was published in 2002. It took us some 3 years actually to get over 40 ministries and agencies and other participants to agree on common definitions. And the 5 original criteria were defined in the glossary. Several other normative products were developed, and I won't go into all of them here, but I wanted to mention the evaluation quality standards as they are relevant in this context. And they grew actually out of a work we tried to do on gender, the synthesis study, which was not possible because we found that many evaluations were not containing essential information. We couldn't compare them, and sometimes they were not even in terms of reference in them, and they were very variable quality. So we really needed to raise the standards. And the standards sounded threatening to some countries. We used a 3-year trial application period among many, many evaluations. And finally, we reached agreement on them in 2010. This is very much about the output and the product of evaluation. And overall, the normative work that we have done has been inspired by the need to raise the bar, not to get to the lowest common denominator. And the norms and standards have a very widespread use, as has been demonstrated in various reviews, including regular reviews that we do every 4 or 5 years, and in the peer review process. They are actually in policies, in guidelines, in manuals, and of course reflected in the terms of references of many thousands of evaluations. So better evaluation involves many features, as I indicate in the graph in the slide here. And I will not go into one particular dimension of better evaluation, and that's the evaluation criteria. The purpose of the criteria is linked to the purpose of evaluation, to enable the assessment of merit, worth, or significance of an intervention. In practice, the criteria are often used by evaluation managers and evaluators with their stakeholders as support to formulate the most relevant questions. Through a demand-led process, actually, we have seen these 5 original criteria become very widely used in the development field and beyond. In fact, the criteria became one of the most downloaded documents on our website and translated into many languages. And there were several other communities beyond the development, and as we are living through a period of uncertainty and war, I might mention that we had even a meeting at the École Militaire here with the Supreme Allied Command of NATO headquarters, not the Brussels one, but the one who's doing operations, when they were sharing their evaluation approaches, and we were sharing our approaches for evaluating and peace building efforts. And we found that we had not very much in common in language, but actually some of the approaches in terms of data gathering and other things. And they were very interested in our criteria and some other purposes. So there were more communities than the development community, and there are more communities interested in this. Of course, also partner countries. One thing with the criteria was that they were remarkably resilient over time to shifts in policies, fashions, and strategies. Moreover, they are not providing a particular and promoting a particular evaluation methodology. And we have always encouraged methodological development and plurality. I see there are some chat things, but I would rather prefer to do my presentation, and then maybe Fabrice, you can take the questions afterwards that come from the various participants. So, as I said, they were quite useful, but we decided to adapt the criteria around 2017. And one of the reasons, there are some reasons here in this graph. One of the reasons is that we had lessons from use. Over the years, a number of challenges with using the criteria were identified, including sometimes not so thoughtful, even mechanical application. And we learned about this criteria. We had, of course, the advent, as you are very familiar with, of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and this led to new learning needs, and we needed better evidence. Furthermore, the development landscape has changed significantly over the years with many new actors.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you just be closer to the microphone, because there's some colleagues who cannot hear very well. Thanks. Sorry about this.
Do you think it's better if I put on this one?
Perhaps. Thanks.
Let me see. I borrowed this from my wife, so it looks quite fancy, I think. Very seldom use it. Do you hear me better? No? Much better. Okay.
Yes.
And I can't hear myself, so that's even better. So this slide describes the process, actually. The main steps in the process of revising and consulting on the criteria. I will not go into detail here, but just say that many of the individuals and many organizations were engaged in this process. We had a number of conferences and meetings and workshops, and it was quite amazing to see the interest, for instance, in the European Evaluation Society, where hundreds of people participated in a lively debate. The findings from this broad-based consultation, you can see here on this slide, essentially broad consensus on their added value, but also some room for improvement. I'll make one quote from the consultations. The main problem with the criteria is when people treat them as a checklist. If they are approached in humility as a preliminary guide about what constitutes worth and merit, then they work fine. So we found they were quite important to the evaluation community, and we had a lot of suggestions. But feedback went beyond the criteria and beyond evaluation. Also heard about the general state of development cooperation, lack of coordination, ownership, etc. So a challenge was to manage expectations. We tried to keep the focus on the criteria concepts, and other work is certainly needed to add broader issues on evaluation and concerning development assistance and its role in promoting development. But as you can see, there was a strong plea for revision, not discarding them. So what's in the new and adapted criteria? We have drawn on all this input, and they have the following features. New and improved definitions of the original 5 criteria. We have preserved and enhanced key strengths in terms of conceptual clarity, and we use notes to explain the definitions. There is one new criteria added, coherence, to better capture linkages, systems thinking, partnership dynamics, and complexity. We're also supporting use by adding an introduction on the intended purpose of the criteria, guiding principles for use, and accompanying guidance to explain further the dimensions of each criteria and how to apply in different evaluations. They are also better responding to current policy priorities, including equality, gender equality, and the leave no one behind agenda. The definition of relevance and effectiveness in particular encourage more in-depth analysis on equity issues. At the same time, the criteria are high level enough to ensure that they will be widely applicable and will remain relevant as policy priorities and goals change over time. Just some points on language and scope. And you can read it yourself, but just want to say that intervention is a term we are using to avoid repeating project, program, strategy, policy, etc. It's also reflecting the fact that we are actually intervening in countries in often complex and interconnected systems, which can affect many things. So let's start with each of the criteria. The relevance. Is the intervention doing the right things? So we have tried to keep a brief, as succinct as possible definition, and having a note explaining what we mean by that short definition. So the note is an integral part. The new definition adds design and implementation to capture other elements related to the quality of the intervention. Before, we had only objectives in the previous definition. So is the intervention well designed to address relevant priorities needs? This means looking at underlying objectives, theory of change, its modus operandi, context, and risk analysis. It's also now making the time dimension much more explicit. Previously, many looked at relevance at the time of design. We are now saying here that the ongoing relevance should be evaluated as well. And evaluating relevance helps to understand if the intervention responds to the needs, priorities, and policies. It can be local needs, but it can also be national, regional, or global priorities, such as the Paris Agreement or the SDGs. And it involves being sensitive to context, to economic, environmental, equity, and capacity conditions, which are all mentioned in here. The definition involves equity and differences between needs and priorities, opening for analysis of gender, power dynamics, and discrimination. Relevance to stakeholders is also a critical factor affecting their ownership and buy-in, which drives sustainability. So this illustrates a link between the criteria, and there are several such links. Coherence is the next one, and this is the new one. How well does the intervention fit? It's a new perspective, not covered previously, and calls for evaluators to understand the role of an intervention within a particular system, for instance, a food security system, public health system, or a sector. It responds to the need for greater attention to complexity and for competing agendas. It encourages analysis of consistency with commitments under international law or agreements. For example, evaluation of national strategies or the extent to which intervention aligns with Paris commitments. Coherence and cross-government coordination is also particularly important in settings of conflict and humanitarian response. And we have already that criteria in our guidance on conflict and conflict prevention and peace building. So now it's sort of mainstream. We distinguish between internal coherence and external coherence, as you can see here, defined in the note. Effectiveness is the next one. And this is a nice short one. And the difference is basically that the previous definition focused much more narrowly on achievement of objectives. We clarify now that effectiveness is concerned with the most closely attributable results. And it's important to distinguish it from impact, which examines high-level effects and broader changes. The primary focus in assessing effectiveness remains on whether intervention has achieved its intended results, usually on the output and outcome level. It encourages evaluators and managers to ask important questions about the distribution of results across different groups, which is also a new feature. So inquiring about the distribution of results across different groups will encourage more thoughtful analysis, attention to gender, equity, and groups. Efficiency. Also a very brief definition. And the note is explanatory. So this is looking at the results, looking at inputs relative to the results as they are occurring during implementation. The timeliness dimension is added, as this was something that we got feedback from. And there is an explicit reference to operational efficiency because implementation process and management issues are often of great interest to evaluation stakeholders. This definition has not changed dramatically, but it has been improved. Impact. What difference is the intervention making? This definition has an emphasis on the significance and transformative nature of the effects. So the definition is more in line with the common usage of the word impact for meaningful or important changes. Broader effects of the intervention as compared to more direct results, which are in focus under the effectiveness criteria. And beyond immediate results, it seeks to capture the holistic changes of systems or norms. It opens up for analysis of potential transformative effects on people's life, people's well-being, gender equality, the environment, and human rights. And importantly, we keep in the definition the unintended effects and impacts. So we have both positive and negative, intended or unintended, which is something that we sometimes do not pay enough attention to in evaluation, but I think important to keep in an overall compassing definition. Sustainability. Our sustainability, the definition is quite a new one. It makes clear that this criterion involves examination of several dimensions: financial, social, environmental, and institutional capacities to sustain benefits over time. So it's broader than environmental sustainability, which is, of course, a very important dimension. And environmental sustainability and environmental is therefore included in several criteria I've seen before here in relevance, coherence, impact, and each time with a different lens to have a more comprehensive assessment of environment sustainability. It's also encouraging analysis of potential trade-offs and of the resilience of systems of capacities to generate the continuation of benefits. For instance, if there are economic benefits, but the environmental costs are very strong, that might make the project unsustainable. It also now covers actual or prospective sustainability. So depending on the timing of the evaluation. This may involve looking at the likelihood of continued positive effects and to factors which might hinder sustainability. Sustainability is linked to relevance. Relevance to stakeholder is a critical factor also affecting the ownership. Sustainability is also linked to effectiveness impact, as if the intervention doesn't achieve results, no benefits to sustain. So this is a picture slide which is providing a somewhat simplified overview of the 6 criteria. The definition, as I said before, involves the notes, which explains the wording, but we wanted to keep it as simple and clear as possible to get an overlook of what we're doing. So the intention here is that each criteria is a lens, giving a different perspective on the intervention, both the implementation process and the results, and conceived to be helpful to have those different lenses on the intervention that is being analyzed.
Sorry, Asa, I couldn't hear you the last 30 seconds. Perhaps there's a problem with audio. Apologies.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry. Now we can hear you.
I hope so. Maybe I'm moving a little bit. That's why. I'm not used to sit still like this. Is it fine? Yeah. Good. So, do you want me to go back to that lens thing?
Thank you.
That? Yeah. That's a different criteria, different perspective of the intervention and the implementation process and the results. As I said, we noticed in our consultation process that there were some issues with the use of the criteria. So we have defined 2 key principles, also quite simple ones. Essentially, that they should be applied thoughtfully, that is contextualized, among other things. And principle 2, that use of the criteria depends on the purpose. We may not be interested in applying all the criteria for a particular evaluation. For instance, if the purpose is mainly to consider an intervention's continued relevance or whether it has operational adaptability, we might only look at the relevance and efficiency criteria. The important issues for a thoughtful application are things like context, purpose, roles, power dynamics, the evaluand, as we say in our evaluation lingo, the object, evaluability, and timing. But it's important also that the definitions of the criteria be understood and used in conjunction with other relevant guidance on how to conduct evaluations, so that evaluation is done in ways that will be useful and respect principles of ethics and other standards that we have agreed on either institutionally or in various associations that we are members of. The guidance on applying the evaluation criteria thoughtfully are available on the OECD iLibrary for those who have not yet got a copy. The guidance, as I see it, will evolve as we learn from the application of the criteria in various types of interventions, in different circumstances, using different approaches. And we also have a new criteria in there that we need to learn more about from the application. So I would suggest that it would be very useful if IFAD evaluation managers and their evaluators, when they use the criteria or other criteria, to document insights on the application in various cases, so we can learn as we go along and even further improve our guidance to them. And I might also add that learning from development interventions implemented during the pandemic and in the humanitarian and peace-building efforts in ongoing close conflicts, which now unfortunately are on most continents of the world, will also provide useful lessons on the application, because they are being used currently in a number of evaluations in such areas during the pandemic. So what more can be found in the guidance? Here are just some examples. For instance, as you said, we have not a specific gender criteria. We are suggesting that gender should be a focus in each of the criteria. And in the guidance on page 33, you will find guiding questions for applying a gender lens under each of the 6 criteria. There are things like challenges in evaluating efficiency, how to address these by evaluators and by evaluation managers. There are equally some insights on challenges in evaluating impact and effectiveness and ways to address these. It's not a full manual on evaluation. It's about how to apply the criteria. So each development agency or ministry, they need to use it as they see fit in their institutional context. I'm aware that each institution has its history and its preferences and its governance structure. That's it from my presentation. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Hans, for your presentation. So particularly appreciated the history of evaluation criteria, the background, also the fruits and roots, the carrots. There's also the sticks. They can also be used as sticks in a positive way. And also thanks for explaining also the evolution and the changes that have taken place, not only the addition of one criterion, but also the opening up and the definitions, and also thanks to the comments that you have received through the consultations. And importance also of contextualizing and not applying in a mechanistic way the criteria. So perhaps we can give now the floor to the participants and those who want to ask questions. And so 1 or 2 questions in the chat, but perhaps it would be nice to hear also from those who have asked question from their own voice. And so the floor is yours. So please, you may want to raise your electronic hand or just your hand, or just speak if by chance I don't see you. So I see Professor Donna Mertens, who is also a member of the Evaluation Advisory Panel of IOE. So please.
Well, it's morning here for me, but good morning, good afternoon, or good evening for wherever you are. Hans, thank you for that interesting presentation, very informative about the changes in the criteria. I did want to know if you could elaborate a little bit on some of the ideas that you raised in terms of relevance. Is that something that's done a priori to determine whether or not the intervention is something that would be the appropriate one for that culture and context to reach the populations that are being intended to serve? Or is that something that's done post hoc to say, was it relevant? And what is the advocacy in terms of how evaluators should be looking at that in a prospective way, particularly in terms of culture and in terms of power differences? We see too many examples of the relevancy test being applied post hoc and saying, oh gosh, it wasn't the right thing, or it wasn't implemented in a good way, it didn't reach the target population. So I'm just curious about your thoughts there. And also regarding the criteria of effectiveness, oftentimes we think of that effectiveness and impact more or less in quantitative terms, like how many people or economic changes. And so I'm wondering also about the advocacy for the collection of mixed methods, qualitative data on the impact on the quality of lives, the way people experience things, and the way their concerns are being taken into consideration for necessary adjustments or revisions. And for sustainability, I wonder about, you did say engagement with stakeholders, and is there an opportunity here for us to elaborate on perhaps strategies for building local coalitions that could have input into both how the intervention is formulated, developed, and implemented, how the evaluation is framed and conducted and used, that would facilitate the buy-in that is usually associated with sustainability, and also provide that mechanism for sustainability because of the representation of members of the community. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much for very rich, excellent questions. Perhaps we can collect questions from 2 or 3 speakers and then give you back the floor, Hans. So in this sense, let me give the floor to Rob Vandenberg, who is also member of Evaluation Advisory Panel. Please, Rob.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Hans, for this overview and your insights into the process and so on. And congratulations on the revised criteria, which are indeed an improvement on the old version and make them a bit more up to date, so to say. At the same time, the revised criteria, as you know, have received a lot of attention, criticism, and some writers have gone to extraordinary lengths to basically decry that the DAC evaluation criteria didn't develop sufficiently in line with the times. And this actually highlights your point that the criteria need to be applied with reasoning. And basically you have to think through regarding the subject that you are tackling, how you would apply them, and whether you need additional criteria or whether you need to look at this in a different way. The criticism, it can be summed up as 2 lost opportunities. The first lost opportunity is that you referred to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, but you do not follow these or the revised criteria. I mean, I'm not talking about you personally. The revised criteria do not follow these in 2 important aspects. The first is that Agenda 2030 asks the member countries of the UN to transform their societies, economies, and their relationship to nature. And transformation is not in there. And it's a hugely difficult subject. It's something that evaluators now have to tackle as a challenge. And they will not find anything in the DAC criteria that will help them. And it's actually a route that has not, it's not complete yet. I mean, we are still, all of us, working on this. And as a result, there could not be any consensus on how that should be approached. We are discovering this along the way. So, but it's an important point that is not incorporated in the revised criteria. Then the second issue is that the SDGs and Agenda 2030 apply to all countries. We should actually move away from development cooperation. And I know that the Development Assistance Committee is, of course, focusing on development. So I have no problem that you are developing criteria or you're rewriting them for development. But actually, all countries are supposed to internalize this, and it's the development from all countries that should be looked at from the SDG perspective, from the transformational perspective. And all countries are working on this. So my thought at the time would have been and was, why don't the DAC deliver these criteria to the UN or to any other body and basically say it's for you to decide. It's no longer a DAC issue. It's really the world, the global community on evaluation, the professional community that should work on this and that should bring this forward. So these two lost opportunities and the fact that this has been called for in the Agenda 2030, which you basically raise as the foundation for the changes, were my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for your thought-provoking intervention. Maybe before we give back the floor to us, if you don't mind, Hans, I would like to give the floor to a colleague of ours in our office, Monica Lomenia. So please, Monica.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Very, very interesting. I wanted just to make two brief points. One is related to what Rob, I think, mentioned now. And when there was this consultation, I was at the African Development Bank. And I remember the reaction of certain of my colleagues, Africans, when like some of these criteria were under discussion. And I had the impression that lots of them were saying, like, once again, something coming from the north that does not relate totally to us and to our governments and to our own conception of development. And I think it's easier to criticize than to come up with something new or really like bottom up. But I think it's true that we have all this like a challenge of saying transformation towards what? Towards an homogenization of the world. Yeah, we have the human rights approach, UN, blah blah. But it's true that then you face real like kind of blockages on the ground, covert or very open. And the second point I wanted to make, and this is more a question, that it was like this also in the previous set of criteria, but it's still there. Like when we are defining impact and sustainability, we are still also including in this broad definition that I know it's applied to many different types of evaluations, these potential impacts, this likely to continuation, these prospects. And sometimes when we are evaluating, especially for independent evaluation, summative evaluation, we are confronted to this, it has happened already or not, because then we cannot say that this already happened. And there is this time dimension, of course, but usually like people implementers say like, yeah, but there is this prospect, we are going towards there. And then how you assess that. And I think maybe the fact that you include in the definition both actual and prospects put us in a kind of weird situation sometimes about how we relate and we try to apply to our organizations and our projects and programs when we are evaluating them. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Monica. And now the floor back to Hans for your feedback and the reactions on these questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you for some of these very tricky questions. Yes. Well, Donna, regarding your question on relevance and target population and so on. Yes, indeed. I mean, this is certainly the idea that when it will of course depend on the nature of the intervention you're looking at, whether we're talking about a local community or whether you're talking about an institution or whether you're talking about a normative change or so on. But the idea is here, of course, that the relevance should be taken into account, all these things. And we are clearly in the definition, as you have seen, referring to different priorities of needs and opening up for an analysis which could go much further than we did traditionally. Actually, originally, it was an easy one, the relevance criteria, because people very often in evaluation, they looked at it as, was this program designed when it was designed, conceived, relevant to the problems at that point in time, either to the groups, to, you know, to the
So, sorry, Ansa, I cannot hear you very well. Apologies. I don't know if it's only my problem, but
so it was an easy criteria earlier. So we have raised the bar on this, and we have really tried to make it a little bit more necessary to do a deeper and more profound analysis around these different dimensions or aspects, rather, of the relevance criteria. Coming to effectiveness, yes, I think we equally there open up for differential results across groups, and certainly for analysis that will pay more attention to equity and gender and so on. I think in terms of building local coalitions for better evaluation frameworks, and I think that goes a little bit beyond the criteria as such. Criteria is just a simple tool, actually. You know, it's not the full evaluation guidebook on how you run mixed methods or other evaluations methodologies, or how you involve stakeholders, how you design your full evaluation. There are many, many more things. And as I said before, they had to be read with other things at the same time, such as principles, such as standards, and what has been agreed in manuals. Now coming to Rob's questions. Well, that was, I know your point already, of course, and you were one of the people that we talked to specifically when we revised the guidance. But, you know, that was kind of a very general criticism that you performed there, I think, that we didn't have a transformative aspect. Actually, we do have transformative in our definition of impact. But we are not so sure that everything is so transformative. We say potentially transformative. We shouldn't be overloading, but rather be realistic about what evaluation can accomplish. And I think that is the realistic need for us to be grounded in what evaluation managers and evaluators do. In terms of your comment on DAC and UN and so on. Well, you know, we have different players in the world. You have the European Union, you have the African community, you have, as you also referred to, Monica, you have many different people doing different things, and you have gurus like yourself writing things. But the important thing here is actually whether it's being picked up or not who's doing it, whether it's useful to people. These criteria have been tremendously used by not only official development agencies in the north, as you said, but we have a number of partner countries who have really picked them up and used them, which we could have seen, which was demonstrated, for instance, in the conference we had in Asia with Sri Lanka and with others, and Philippines referring to them in their national evaluation policies. As I indicated, there are also other communities beyond development. So for me, the test is not really what some people think here and there, but the most important thing is, are they being picked up by people who are using them in actual evaluations? And here we've seen that there's been a demand-driven thirst, actually, for these criteria. And that's why we put so much effort to getting them a little bit better. I'm not saying this is the perfect and final thing, but I do think they will survive the SDGs. And previous criteria also survived various and different shifts in policies. We are actually now which is very unfortunate because SDGs were and are still sort of a really good vision for the future. But already, a couple of years ago, we saw that it's not working towards, realistically speaking, to achieving those goals in the SDGs, particularly not now with the setback of the pandemic and with the setback of the war in Ukraine. We will have a lot of other challenges to deal with. But we cannot, every time there is a new policy, devise fundamentally new criteria. They have to be standing the test of time, standing the test of different policies coming up. And that's our objective. On the perspective on sustainability that Monica asked, yes, we have prospective sustainability in there now, which I think is very often what you will have to look at, because it's a difficult call sometimes unless you come in there some time after. And that means looking into the likelihood of continued sustainability, continued net benefits, and factors that might hinder that, which will involve things like ownership of the people who are involved in the program, or of the ministry if you're supporting a public health system and so on. It will be. You can't hear me?
Yeah. We missed here and there. We miss a few words.
I'm very sorry about that. I'm very sorry about that. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'm sorry about the technical problem. Yes, no, I was saying that, yes, prospective sustainability will be, we will need to look at the factors that might hinder it and the likelihood of it continuing, and the systems and the capacities supporting them, because that's what we want to build for continuation of benefits, that those capacities and systems actually can continue to. I hope I covered to some extent the various questions I've got, and also giving a little personal what is sort of swearing in the church in relation to the SDGs. But I'm thinking, as evaluators, we want to speak truth to power. We want to be realistic, and we want to be ground to earth. We need to say what's real and not really what we hope that things should be. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Let's see if there's any more questions. I saw, for example, some comments in the chat, but perhaps those who added comments may want to speak, so we can hear also from them and understand better their questions. Perhaps Donna, did you want? I think you had also some text in the chat. Would you like to?
I was just responding to what Monica had said about her African colleagues saying that these are criteria that come from the North. And so I'm wondering, Hans, the nature of the discussion around issues like that when the criteria are developed and implemented. My acquaintance with members of the African Evaluation Association and their framing of Made in Africa evaluations contain criteria for quality that are quite culturally specific and contextually appropriate. And so I wondered about that, like, how did that come into the discussion?
Thank you. And I think also our director, Indran, wanted to ask a question.
No, thank you very much. But since we're coming to the time, thank you, Hans, for this very useful presentation, also taking us along the journey from the inception to where it is now. As you know, the UN network has been actively engaged on the criteria discussion. It used the NEC conferences in, if I recall, Bangkok, Istanbul, as well as Egypt to talk about the criteria. I know the very robust discussion that happened at the EES in Greece, which, and many people were concerned that it had not addressed all the issues. But I think the issue of principle is that the criteria is a set of options that can be used and should be used also by contextualizing it based on the questions. It's never ever going to answer, every evaluative question. The questions remain extremely fundamental. And for that reason, I think the criteria has come up with a set of guidance on how it should be used, because the alternative would be to make the criteria something that is imposed. It's not imposed, it's a guideline. And even here at IFAD, we use the criteria, but we use it with carefully. And it does not detract from the questions that we ask. So each of the criteria has a set of questions that, that go on it. I am a bit cautious about the homogenizing of the North and South, as if there's two different worlds here and with complete different ways of thinking, that exists, and the global North, the global South. I think in the context of high differentiation, those boundaries are extremely blurred. And we don't really have that hegemonic, view that comes from both ends. These criteria are used, much of my professional life has been in the so-called South. We use the criteria and we're able to show with the same criteria, things don't work. And it's not linked to any cultural or any other element on that. So the questions need to come in. For example, if you got the issue of relevance, the gender focus must come in. The question of whether it's answering the questions of the time, for the time, needs to also come in. So this tends to be a lot of marching on the spot, and there's a lot of heat and less light in the discussions. But at the end of the day, evaluators don't want to be told what to do. The criteria does that. It's a set of options. Use it and make sure that you have the questions on here. We are going to include the element on criteria in our evaluation manual, and we're going to include links to all the options and the conversations, so people get a deeper understanding of it. It is not gospel. It is not cast in stone. We select criteria as and when needed in order to make sure that we do the work. But more important than that is really the evaluative questions that we ask. So from my end, and thank you to all the panelists online, we will pull the information. This has been a very rich, and it will remain an ongoing discussion. And I think it's good that we agree to disagree agreeably, because that will deepen our understanding of what needs to be done. But I come back to the point in, thanks, Hans, know you for more than 2 decades now for your contribution, to the network, to all the colleagues online. We also look forward to the insights that you provide us as a member of the advisory panel with the other colleagues online as we implement the manual in IFAD, because what we want to do is to try to get a conversation that has a more common vocab. So we are talking more at the same purpose rather than at cross purpose. So with that, thank you again. Thanks to all of you for participating. We will make the audio and this presentation available together with the materials. I hand over to Fabrizio. Thanks.
No, and I don't have. I will not add much more. Just to say that the PowerPoint will be made available. So thank you for participation and for the discussion, which probably will continue in other instances. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.